Welcome to video 4 of our Teach at Home, Teach Online series. In this session, we're going to look at interaction and engagement in the online classroom. And we have for you our top 10 super tips for engagement in the online classroom, numbered here from chat management at number 1 to space matters at number 10. And we're going to work through these. For some of the tips that we have here, we've got some little clips that have been made in our Big Blue Button classroom. That's just because that's what we had to hand, but the tips are all relevant, we believe, for any online classroom that you might be using. So let's make a start. The idea of a chat blast is that it encourages students to all respond at once rather than waiting to see what other students have written into the chat before they respond for themselves. So let's take a look at what we call a chat blast. So the idea with the chat blast is that we're going to get as many students as possible to respond to a question in a way that encourages them to respond the way they would do without sort of peer pressure from other participants in the room. So if I can ask the students that are in the room with me at the moment, take a look at the question that's on the screen at the moment, have a think about factorising that expression as fully as you possibly can, and can you then please type the answer that you think is correct for that one into the chat box, but please don't press return yet. It's really important. Don't click return until I ask you to do that. There's a little kind of meta technique here that I think is worth mentioning as well. Students won't necessarily know how to type things like powers into the chat box. So a little bit of advice on you use the caret sign, which is the kind of up arrow on the above the 6 on the keyboard. You can use that to indicate a square and so on. Okay, folks, so I'm hoping that everybody's got something typed into the chat box. If you can all please click return now. And you can see there that that big row of answers has all clicked into the chat box, and we've got a nice little bit of variety going on in there. Lovely. Oh, I like the look of those. You notice here that I've given a little bit of advice on how to type mathematics into the chat box. And our second tip is all about using a keyboard to type algebra. This can be a little bit fiddly, and it's worth spending a little bit of time teaching your students how to do this so that when they do use it in the chat, it's nice and confident. So things like how to type a fraction, making sure that you use brackets in order to make sure that the top line and the bottom line of the fraction are clear. Ways to write indices, ways to write square roots and other kinds of roots. And it's worth sitting down with your department and thinking about what else might be useful in terms of you teaching your students how to write algebra in a way that's understandable and accurate. The next top tip is polling. I've got an example here of factorising as fully as possible, and I'm going to show you a little clip here of this in action in the classroom. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at polling. Now, some online classrooms have a polling facility built in, including this one. So we're using Big Blue Button, and you can use the polling functionality in here if you have it. But also, you can actually use polling type questions without having special built-in functionality for that. And that's what we're going to do with this one. So we have a multi-choice question on the screen here for our students to take a look at. And all I've done is set up that question with a series of possible answers. And again, I'm going to ask them to put their answers into the chat box for this. It's a nice way, again, of getting lots of students to respond to a question. You know that they're engaging with it. It's sort of a no pressure thing where they can respond to a question without having to worry too much about other people watching them being the only person replying. So folks, if you'd like to give an answer in the chat box for this one, that would be great. Okay, so we have some A's and some B's, and I'm thinking with this one it was C, but that would then lead to further discussion of that question. Here we're going to look at using the text tool in order to encourage students to write on the screen. I've set up this slide and put it into our Big Blue Button classroom, and this is it in action. On this slide, we're going to do a little bit of work on writing on the screen. Now, this particular classroom that I'm using at the moment has shared whiteboard access. So you can see here that my little cursor is appearing on the screen in red, and also some of my students are popping up in green as well on here because I've set them all to use a functionality going. If you're using a separate whiteboard app, you probably have similar kind of functionality that you can use whichever classroom you're going to be using. Writing on the shared whiteboard can be a bit of a challenge, especially if your students are trying to write with a mouse. So there are some little techniques that are worth kind of bearing in mind here. What I've done here is I've said, what word would you use? So keeping the answer here nice and short is a good choice. So just a single word for them to write. And also I can encourage them to use the text tool. Most online classrooms have the capacity to switch to a text tool instead of trying to handwrite with a mouse, which is quite tricky. I could encourage them to use the text tool just to put a word next to each of the items that they see on the screen. If you'd like to have a little go at that for me, my guest students, that would be lovely. Also at this point, I'll quite often encourage the group, well, don't all work on the first one first. If you want to pick one in the middle or one at the end or something like that, and move around, and then you get a little bit more, again, kind of peer-free responses to the question. That's lovely. And I love how my students here have dived in and chosen a different colour for their text for each of them. That's another great tip to recommend if you do have lots of students working on the same screen together. If they have a colour of their own that they like to use, then that's a good way to sort of identify who's doing what. And next we're going to take a look at screen sharing or application sharing. This is a really powerful tool in the online classroom for being able to use things like dynamic geometry shared with students. And here it is in action. What I've done here on the slide that's on the screen at the moment is actually to screenshot the application that I'm just about to share. And the reason I've done that is because our experience is that sometimes screen sharing and app sharing can be a bit on the wobbly side. It's one of the parts of using the online classroom that needs a bit of practice and a little bit of confidence, and particularly needs good broadband connection. So what we tend to do is sort of belt and braces if we're using an app share type arrangement in our teaching, is to have a screenshot of what it should look like, just in case things don't quite work out the way they should. But crossing my fingers and hoping it does. In this particular classroom that I'm using, if you click on the share button that's down here under the screen, you get a window of options available to you. You can see here I'm being offered the opportunity to share my entire screen, to share the application window, or to share my Chrome tab. And this is similar in Teams and also in Zoom. Other online classrooms have a similar kind of arrangement. I would strongly recommend going for sharing an application window rather than sharing the entire screen. And there are two strong reasons for this. The first reason is that sharing the entire screen is quite network intensive, so it takes quite a lot of bandwidth. And obviously, if you can save bandwidth, that's going to give people a better experience. The other very good reason is that if you share your entire screen, if something pops up on your screen by way of a notification of an email, etc., that will be visible to your students as well. And sometimes that could be something of a GDPR issue, if not extremely embarrassing. So I would definitely recommend application window is a sort of a lightweight way of sharing what you're doing. So I'm just going to share my GeoGebra window here. And hopefully my students will give me a little emoticon in the chat just to let me know that they can see that. Lovely. Okay, that's great. And so now I can have this application open on a separate screen if I've got one available, or I can switch to it if I prefer, and I can operate that application and show the students how things change. Just bear in mind that anything dynamic, so if I change the graph on here dynamically, that change will transfer through to the participants a bit more slowly, so it may be a little bit juddery or a little bit shaky, and just to watch out for that. Now, student audio is something that depends really on the type of class that you're going to be working with. So it can be a massive asset in certain situations. We have here a couple of cases to consider. So for example, if we were working with an A-level group, it's just 6 students and they're studying trig identities. That's a topic that's quite hard to type into the chat box. because of the symbolic algebra that's required in order to be able to represent those topics. And we've got quite a small group here. If they're doing A-level, they're probably spending quite a lot of time working together, so they know each other relatively well. And so I would suggest that case 1 there is a good example of where you might want to use microphones, encourage the students to talk so that they can describe the algebra to you, so that they can talk through the methods that they're using. In case 2, we've got a huge group of 2 Year 11 sets combined. And that came to about 56 students and working on measures of location and spread, so mean, standard deviation, and so on. In that case, I would suggest that using the microphones is going to be difficult. Only a few students would be able to contribute via that method. You wouldn't have time to hear from all of the students in that particular group. So in that case, I would probably not use student audio. I would design the questioning for that session to be able to minimize the need for microphones from the students. So lots of nice short answer questions, using multi-choice so that we can use polling, making it easy for students to give text responses and to use the chat blast that we recommended in tip number 1. The next tip is all about quiet students versus loud students. So this is something that occurs, I have to admit, more often than not with professional development. So we quite commonly have a huge enthusiast in our professional development session who wants to answer everything, and that's great. But sometimes we do want to find ways to encourage those quieter students to engage as well. So we have some little hints and tips for that, so some suggestions there, things that you can use in order to make it possible for all students to contribute fairly and for you to be able to assess progress for all of your students in your group. So for example, we talked earlier about the chat blast. That can be a good way to do it. We can encourage students to make their own space on the screen. So if you divide up your slide into areas where a student can write or use the text tool to write onto the screen, that can be a good way to do it. You could ask a student to explain their working, one of your quiet students, or perhaps one of the loud students as well, to just go through the working in a bit more detail. Even better, to ask a student to explain your own working instead of explaining theirs, to talk through what you've put onto the slide already. You could look at using a sort of systematic response method. So every third person on the user list, you could ask, next I'm going to ask this person, next I'm going to ask this person, and so on. I quite like the idea of nominate the next student. So if somebody answers a question, then it becomes their job to nominate the next student to respond to a question. And that can be quite a big responsibility for a student to handle. Our next tip is all about size matters, up to a certain point. So we said earlier that the plan for 6 students is very different from the plan for, well, even 20 students. If you've got more than 20 students with one teacher, you're going to need quite careful structure, and you need the students to know the expectations of the classroom really well. So you need them to know when it's okay to respond, how do you want them to use the chat, and so on. The plan for 20, though, is very similar to the plan for 50 or 100. If you've got more than one person leading, you can handle pretty much any number in the classroom. So the big tip in terms of class size from us is that if you've got anything more than about 20, it really does make a huge difference to be able to have a second person in the room supporting the person who's leading the session. And space matters. That's our final tip. Make sure you build additional space into your plan, particularly when you're starting out. Things will take longer than you expect, and things will take unexpectedly longer than you think. So stuff that you think is absolutely normal within a lesson is weirdly going to take longer in the online classroom than you thought it was going to. So make sure you build additional space in for that unexpected pause. It's a good rule of thumb to try and do one thing well in your first session instead of worrying about trying to jam all the content into a single session. So think about going to depth rather than going for volume, if you see what I mean. Leave time for unexpected issues to arise, and leave space for students to get used to this new way of working. It's a big change for you, but it's also a big change for them. So make sure that there's space for them to be able to get confident with what you're doing. We have a little what not to do. So We found originally that students don't naturally know what the expectations are in the online classroom. We used to find that conversations would start in the chat while the teacher was delivering. It got really distracting for the teacher and for other students. And it wasn't really a sort of malicious reasoning. It was literally that the students didn't know that that's not okay, that it can be distracting for people. So now we always explain that the chat is audible and visible to everybody. We also tell the students that the chat will ping for the tutor in the room. So if they keep posting something in the chat over and over, it's constantly pinging in the teacher's ear. We tell any group that start a conversation in the chat, it's like talking when the teacher's talking. That's exactly what it is. And we also tell them that in the real classroom, they'd wait for visual cues to know when it's okay to ask a question. Here, they have to listen for audio cues instead. And it's just good manners, really. But it does need to be made clear. Students do need to have it explained to them what those expectations are.